if these recipes aren't being cooked in my home kitchen, they cease to be the things I want them to be. I wanted a calm space to cook in, and this to me feels really calm. For me to have creative thoughts and have the space to think, I need expanses of space. I remember making a decision as a little kid that I had to be strong, that I had to be there to support my parents, that I couldn't unravel. I think it's a really big thing for a 10-year-old to decide, and I have in a lot of ways become the sort of steady one in my family. The things that have happened in this house are going to be some of the most formative moments and most important things that will ever happen to me and will ever happen to the 4 humans that live here. It feels part of us.
Hi, Anna.
Hey.
Thanks so much for having us here.
Oh, it's just lovely to have you.
Yeah,
it's lovely to have you.
It's really good to be here. So I'd like to start by going back to your childhood.
Mm-hmm.
Where did you grow up?
I was born in Birmingham and I spent a couple of years there. And then a few formative years in California.
Oh.
So my dad is one of 12 children. He's number 9 out of 12. And kind of the matriarch of our family was my Auntie Avril, who's not with us anymore, but she lived in America and we kind of followed her there. And she sort of lived this magical, brilliant, sort of free life in California. So we lived there for a few years. I was quite young and I went to nursery there, but I feel like it was quite a sort of formative thing for me because, you know, there was sunshine, there was amazing produce, there was kind of this quite free way of being. And I loved it there. And I've had like quite a draw back there ever since. So yeah, we were there for a few years and then we kind of came back to England, to London, and then we settled just outside London in Surrey, basically.
What age were you then?
I was only about sort of 5, I think, when we came back.
Okay.
But we spent every summer back in California with my auntie. So even though I was quite young when I came back, it sort of felt, it feels like it was a really big part of my childhood.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
So if I ask you where home was then when you were a child, where was it?
It was my mum and dad's house in Surrey for sure.
Okay.
And they're still in that house. They still live there. And yeah, it was a lovely house to grow up in.
What was the house itself like?
It's a thatched cottage and it's, yeah, I think it's sort of about 1900, so it's not sort of an ancient thatched cottage. And inside it had been sort of renovated quite a few times. So it was one of those houses, I guess, that sort of the feeling inside didn't totally match the feeling outside. But the feeling inside was home. I think the main space we spent time in was this big sort of kitchen and family room, which actually was something my mum and dad sort of added to the house. And it was this big sort of round room with a sort of beamed roof, and the kitchen overlooked this round living room. And it's where we spent, you know, the rest of the house could almost not have existed. We just spent all our time there. And that sort of threw out onto the garden. You know, that must have done something to me because that sense of like the kitchen being the nucleus and the focus it is for so many people, but obviously that has extra meaning in the life of a cook. And yeah, it was a very happy home. It was a safe place to grow up. You know, we could sort of run out in the streets in a way that I kind of really wish my kids could do now. And it was a neighbourhood, you know, there were children, you know, I'd run down the road and there were 5 or 6 people I could play with, my sister and my brother.
So there were 3 of you, were there?
3 of us, yeah. I'm the oldest.
You're the oldest, okay.
Yeah, and then I've got a sister who's a bit younger than me and then a brother who's much younger, who's 10 years younger.
Okay.
So he was our kind of like, you know, almost like our baby, our toy growing up for me and my sister.
Did you baby him then?
I think we did a bit.
Yeah.
You know, I was 10 when he was born and I was sort of, you know, so excited about his arrival. And I've just found him so adorable. And I was so excited. I think I was like a mini mum. I was so excited about all the different stages for him, about, feeding him his first food and, and making things for him and when he walked and stuff. And it was really lovely to have that, I think, because I think so many children sort of miss their siblings sort of growing and changing because you're doing it together, which obviously has value too. But no, I guess for when I had my own kids, I had a kind of sense
Yeah.
of what that might have been like. Obviously, my mum was doing all the hard stuff and we were just doing all the fun. But yeah.
That's really sweet.
He's still very adored by the whole family.
Is he? He's done well there.
But I did start cooking really quite early. I think what my mum and dad, they love food. They love eating. They love eating out. They love being fed. But I wouldn't say that they love cooking. They both grew up without much money. And so I think food was something that was, that was very much something that sustained them rather than something that they had the time and, headspace to consider a joy,
Yeah.
And so I think that definitely feeds into their relationship to food and cooking. Cooking wasn't something for me I sort of have necessarily learned off someone.
Yeah.
But what my parents were and still are amazing at is noticing their children and noticing the things that lit them up. And so from quite a young age, I had, a stack of cookbooks, and I wasn't just making kind of Rice Krispie cakes. I was sort of, they'd go and buy the ingredients for this recipe for me to make dinner. And I was doing that from sort of 10 or 11 years old. And that was definitely the beginning of something.
That's really nice, isn't it? How do you explain why you were drawn to food in that way? If it just wasn't in the family at all? I mean, am I right in saying your mum didn't even have an oven when she was growing up?
Yeah. No, I don't think she did. They just had a hob. So my mum grew up in, the very beginnings of her life, just in one room. My grandma was the housekeeper and they just had a little hob. And, I think it was probably that situation that I'm sure lots of families still find themselves in, where sometimes my grandma wasn't eating so that she had enough for my mum. So, yeah, I think for me, where that came from was, I know that joy, that food is what sort of brings my family joy. And I could sense that sort of moment sitting around the table was a special thing. I also think I really got something out of the alchemy of it too, of the fact that I could mix flour and sugar and this and that, pop it in the oven for a few minutes, and it completely transformed. And I guess I was quite a shy child. So, I think also that was a way of, making something and contributing something, but without it being necessarily about me. It was about the thing that I'd made and brought to the table, rather than, and it was a couple of steps removed from me. So maybe it was quite a nice way to express myself too.
I can see that because, I was a shy child as well, and I understand that in the sense that the performative side of cooking is actually kind of behind the scenes a bit, isn't it?
Yeah.
And you're sort of in control of it.
Yeah.
And the act of creation is something you can do semi-privately, and then with a flourish you can present the result.
Exactly. You can put the plate down and, you can sit at the table, or you can walk away and let, and just hear people enjoying it, a few steps away. And, I wouldn't consider myself a shy person anymore, but still I do feel nervous for a few minutes. I really hope everyone's going to enjoy it. I really hope that this is going to be the thing that they wanted to eat, the thing that suits this moment, the thing that, makes this table and this group of people, more harmonious and happy. And I've always loved that when I cooked in restaurants. I sort of always loved that, the plate would go out and you could sort of, slightly be an observer to sort of what the reactions of people are.
That's interesting. Is there something a little bit about sort of seeking approval as well when you cook something, do you think?
I think so, definitely, yeah. I think I definitely, as a child and still have, I like to do things for people. I like to kind of, I think there is definitely a sort of people-pleasing element to my character. Yeah, so I think there's definitely a level of kind of approval and wanting people to enjoy and wanting it to be, I am definitely in the kitchen, a perfectionist, and that stops me doing things at times, and that pushes me on at times. And it's a nice side to have to your character, but also it's, it can be annoying.
Yeah, I get that. Well, exactly. People pleasing is a double-edged sword, isn't it? For you, why do you think that you were trying to please a particular person, or was it part of your character inherently, do you think?
Yeah, I think it's a mixture of things. I think definitely there was some approval from my parents. I think probably from my dad, I would say. My mom a bit too, but my mom was sort of, she was at home. She was the steady, loving support. And my dad was absolutely a steady, loving support too. But there was just slightly more to prove in a way. I think also, there was this huge, amazing family that dad has. There's the 12 brothers and sisters, but with that came sort of 35 cousins. And, I think one of my formative sort of memories of feeding groups of people was at my nan's house, and she lived in a tiny terrace house in on the edge of Birmingham. But on Sundays, everyone would come round for a roast. Everyone would come round, and they almost couldn't fit in to the house. There was no dining table. The table was just a little fold-down table that was shoved between two sofas. And so when everyone came round, it would come out, the leaves were brought out, and there were 5 or 6 chairs, but we'd be on, me and my sister, 2 of us be on one arm of the sofa, another couple of cousins would be on the others. And so I think really that was a very formative experience for me, that food meant togetherness, that gathering around that kind of Sunday roast, which sort of, was legendary. My nan cooked in a space, that we would probably call a cupboard these days. But, for years and years and years, she turned out, dinner for sort of 16 people every night. So I think that sort of feeling of togetherness and, sharing really kind of, I think, must have landed quite deeply in me.
Yeah, that's brilliant. Tell me a bit more about your dad then. What did he do for work?
He worked in finance, essentially. So he, I think, was the first person, common story, but the first person from his family to go to university, and he did pretty well. And then, went and worked in the local Lloyd's Bank as a cashier for quite a few years, and then went to America and got a job in Bank of America there, and then worked his way up and sort of ended up in this very different life to what he'd grown up in, this life where he was, working in finance in London around people with lots and lots and lots of money. But he's still remained very much very much the boy from Kings Norton, because he still won't pay for a taxi. He still will, save food until it's, until it's a week past its sell by date, because he doesn't want to throw it away. And I think that's magic.
And what about your mum? Is she still alive as well?
Yeah. My parents are, alive and well. And actually, I think lots of my friends sort of prefer hanging out with them to me. They're really the life and soul. And I feel very, very lucky to be able to say that I love, my parents are so loved, and it's sort of both ways. As with any family, there've been ups and downs, and I think especially when you have a very big family, there's more people to pass away and more sadness that can happen, but they are still very much in love. They still are great kind of bon viveurs. They are really living life in their mid-70s, and I find it really very much what I would like to be, in 30 years' time or whatever.
That's really nice to have that template, isn't it?
It really is, actually. It really is, because I feel like they just don't feel old. They are still, so interested in culture and music and in sharing and socializing, and they haven't sort of ratcheted that down at all.
So how do you feel about your old family home then when you go back there? What sort of part does that play in your life?
That's such a funny question. Me and my sister have a very funny relationship with our family home, because I think we have maybe developed a slightly different aesthetic to what our parents have. And I think in that spirit of making do, that I think, must have been such a part of that generation who were born, just after the war. Mom and dad will just make do. They will sort of have, they will have a fridge that is 25 years old, and and so I think when we go back there, the house has its foibles, it has its kind of frustrations. But I think as with any house, you sort of learn, the house it's a part of life. This house probably that people would find annoying or wouldn't find completely natural. So it's funny when we go home, especially in their kitchen, because I want everything to be at my fingertips. And my mum and dad, they cook a little bit, but not too much. When me and my sister, because we love to cook, we go home, we do get a bit frustrated.
I think that's very normal.
Yeah, I think it is. And it's so interesting, isn't it, when you go back to your family home. And I feel very lucky to be in this stage of my life and still to be able to go back to that family home and to parents who are still together and who are still there. What a privilege that is. But we do regress, don't we? I regress. I become my teenage self. My sister does, my brother does. And it's almost by walking, it's almost like a time machine. When I walk over that threshold and into that house, there are kind of patterns of behavior that come out that would never come out in my own home. And yeah, you've got to laugh.
That's so true. That's such a good description of it. Who do you become then?
Oh, I think I just become like a little bit less patient, and a little bit more like, I don't know, just a little bit more, impatient and a bit more kind of, a bit more of a teenager.
Yeah, Bolshiano.
Yeah, not proud of it all the time, but we're, we all behave in a way, that, I would love to say that I'm completely calm and measured and make absolutely the right choices and use the right words all the time, but I don't. None of us do. And I find that particular thing of how that home transports me back almost to the point at which I left it within minutes of being in it is really something.
Yeah, that's fascinating, isn't it? You've described actually a really happy childhood, kind of humble but happy, which is really lovely. I wonder if there's, because we all have them, what would have been the kind of more challenging parts of childhood for you?
I think there was a point at which I don't know if you would sort of, I was probably, now you would call it being bullied. I don't think it was necessarily, a sort of major situation, but I do remember sort of sticking up for one of perhaps the more particular and unusual members of the class, and that then set a bunch of the kind of like cool kids against me. And that must have been when I was probably my son's age, about 10. But I definitely then, because I was already quite a shy kid, I then definitely, felt what it was like to be ostracized. And that felt really difficult. And round about that time, we had quite a big year of very difficult things happening. I mean, both of my mum's mum and dad's mum died, within sort of a few months of each other, which obviously they were young, but it was kind of, I guess, the natural order. But also we had a family who were our best friends, and they were killed in the Lockerbie Air Disaster.
Oh, seriously?
Which was really, really, really difficult, obviously, as a family to deal with, because it was almost a sort of sliding doors moment, because they also had family who lived in the States, and we did too. And it was Christmas, and we were both going to get a flight. They were going the day before, we were going the next day. And I remember it so clearly. We went to their house and we said goodbye to them. I think the day before they left, they had 2 daughters who were exactly the same age as me and my sister. The mom was called Geraldine. My mom's called Geraldine. There were so many kind of similarities. And, they got on their flight one night. We got on our flight the next morning. And they didn't make it to America. And we did. And I really remember the moment that I found out. My dad, we were sitting in my auntie's apartment and in California, and my dad was sort of looking through the paper, because at that point he traveled back and forth to New York a lot for work, and he was double checking that none of his work colleagues had been on the plane, and he read their 4 names: John, Geraldine, Hannah, Rachel, Stevenson. And then just sort of I saw my parents just unravel in front of me. And yeah, it was a really, really, I'm not someone that remembers things with very lucid detail, but I really remember the moments and the feelings of that. And I remember sort of making a decision as a little kid, like, that I had to be strong, that I had to be there to support my parents, that I couldn't unravel. I think it's a really big thing for a 10-year-old to decide. And I do feel like that has, I have sort of in a lot of ways become the sort of steady one in my family, the kind of reliable one that doesn't cause too much drama.
That's the people pleasing.
Yeah, yeah. And without getting too philosophical, like, I do wonder whether it sort of came from that moment.
Wow. That's really, thanks for sharing that. That's what a remarkable thing to have lived through.
Yeah.
As you say, so it's so cinematic, actually, the way you described
Yeah.
it, but it is a sliding doors moment. So do you feel like you still carry that moment with you then?
I definitely do. I do feel like, those 2 lovely girls, Hannah and Rachel, they didn't get to have this life. And so I don't think of it all the time, but I would say every few weeks I do think, I do think of them. And I do think that, what a privilege that I get to live this life. And, I think in a sense that perhaps drives me to kind of just to try and make life as full and brilliant and sort of full colour as it can be.
Are you okay with flying, out of interest?
Weirdly, I am.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's good.
I'm not sure if it's total dissociation.
Yeah,
But yeah.
that's good.
I'm actually fine with it. I'm
Yeah.
fine with it.
Okay, so you described it that you sort of almost took on the role of the responsible one in the family somehow. So let's move on then to your sort of early food career opening in front of you. So what was the unlocker for that initially?
I'd sort of always cooked, and, as I sort of mentioned, my mum and dad were really good at kind of furnishing me with the kind of confidence and agency and ingredients, to do that. And then as I kind of grew a bit older, I think I started cooking for my mum and dad's friends. I cooked for mum and dad for dinner parties and stuff like that, because not for money, just because I've enjoyed it. So they'd have their friends round, I'd make some food, and then that sort of became a bit of a thing. So then I'd go and cook for their friends, and when they'd have 10, 15 people round. And I really love that experimentation. I love that going in with all of my stuff and sort of quietly sort of working away in the kitchen, and then, having this sort of rapturous reception. And, they'd all had too much wine and there was so much praise at the end of it. And, it just felt like I was helping create this really lovely sort of, moment. And so that, I guess, was the start. But I think because I went to a school that kind of valued sort of academic achievement, and the sort of soft subject was economics. It wasn't, you could do art, but that had to be on top of all of your other things. It wasn't a kind of, creativity, I don't think, was necessarily valued in the same way as it might be now, or it might have been at a more creative school. So I didn't ever think of it as something that I could do as a job. I sort of ended up doing an economics degree, and, sort of working, I wanted to go and work at sort of the World Bank or the IMF or something like that, and work in like development economics. But I realized that you actually would need a PhD to do that. And I think when I really looked into it, I just didn't want to study for that much longer. So I got a job, I did various different jobs. I went and cooked and worked in a bar in the mountains for a bit and sort of moved around and did all sorts of things. But eventually I landed up in this job, I guess, doing sort of financial PR, really. But I read an article in a paper, I think it was actually in the Times Literary Supplement, that said you should determine your calling by the bit of the Sunday paper you turn to first.
Oh, good one.
Which actually was great. And that was a real sort of, then I was like, what am I doing here? Like, food is the thing that gets me excited. Why am I not doing this? And that started something. And from there onwards, I was sort of looking for cooking courses. And eventually I, to cut a long story short, found the Jamie Oliver 15 course. But I thought I was really absolutely in no way eligible for it. I had a university education, I had a job. I was really like, I was fine.
Just to explain to people that don't know, what was Jamie Oliver's 15 course?
So Jamie Oliver started a restaurant called 15, and it was really a kind of social enterprise. It's sadly closed now, but the idea was that every year he would take 15 young people, and these were people from challenging backgrounds, where they were, either stuck in a difficult situation or, there were definitely barriers to them getting work. And every year he would take 15 people, train them up as chefs and send them off into the industry. Such a lovely thing. And the restaurant was this beautiful restaurant, just sort of behind Old Street, beautiful old building. And it was at a time when Jamie Oliver was really, he was in his ascent. And so I sort of saw that there was an interview day, but I really thought, I'm not from a challenge background by any stretch of the imagination. I was fine. But I went along anyway, and somehow they picked me. There was a series of interviews and this hilarious sort of filmed Outward Bound weekend where we were sort of building bridges out of matchsticks, etc.
Oh, seriously?
And doing some cooking because it was all for TV. It was still a TV show. God,
I did watch that.
Yeah. It was sort of strange to be filmed, but also quite exciting. And anyway, I got onto the course, and from the moment that I sort of found the course to me quitting my job and starting in the restaurant, it was about 10 days. So it all happened so quickly. I almost didn't have time to think about it. And I had to sort of quit my job. And I remember them saying, well, you've got 3-month notice. And I just sort of had to say, I'm so sorry. I literally can't. I can't work it out. This amazing thing has happened. They didn't think it was as amazing.
They took you to court. And then...
Yeah, well, luckily not. But yeah, it was one of those moments where you're like, I've got to do this. And from there, it felt like sort of cooking on fast forward, really. I learned so much in that kitchen, and it was very special in the way that each sort of trainee chef was paired with a working professional, amazing chef in the kitchen. So you weren't sort of just thrown into a kitchen and told to sort of peel the potatoes. You were really learning each section of the kitchen from someone who really knew their stuff, and you were really shadowing someone. And there was also this wonderful kind of pastoral care as well, because lots of the kids, and young adults had come from difficult situations. So there was this team of, people that were sort of supporting your life from that sense as well. And it was so brilliant. And also for me as someone, I was sort of in this group with people that I never would have been friends with. There was like car thieves, there was professional criminals, essentially, who were wanting to turn over a new leaf. It was just such a funny pairing. But yeah, it was absolutely amazing. And yeah, from there, then I sort of leapfrogged over at the end of my training there to work for Jamie Oliver, sort of in his, I guess, media business, you'd call it. So
yeah. So you were doing sort of, styling for him, weren't you? And recipe
I was doing
stuff?
styling and helping with recipe development and all of those. Yeah. So by that point, it was quite a big business. There was, cookbooks, there was products, there was TV appearances, and that was one element of the business. And then, there was the restaurants and other things as well. So it was such an amazing education in seeing all these different facets of the food world, very intensely the sort of restaurant world, but also, this whole other world opened up for me, which was, writing about food and using cooking in this very creative way, making food not to look nice for photos, because the food I make is always the food that I eat. I would never put anything else on the plate, but, just considering food in a different way, considering, the creativity of like what bowl to put this food in or what surface to put this bowl on. And I've always been a fan of keeping things very simple. It's just a whole different creative way of thinking about food that really, really sort of got me going.
That's brilliant, isn't it? And then, so how did that lead to your first cookbook?
Well, I ended up writing a cookbook for innocent drinks back in the day. It was called Hungry. It's still kicking around somewhere. I think it's on my shelves here. But I guess similar to sort of Jamie Oliver, they were quite a sort of disruptive business, and they were also, they'd only been around a few years, and they wanted to write this family cookbook. And as with those kind of disruptive businesses, they just had the most brilliant and inspiring people working there. And I worked with their sort of creative team, and it just felt so fun. It felt like there weren't any barriers to anything. You could kind of, but just their ideas and their way of kind of following through on very creative things was really, really inspiring. Anyway, I wrote a book with them, which was really fun, which we then toured around the country, and, those sort of grass-covered ice cream vans they used to drive around in. So we toured around the country in a grass-covered ice cream van, giving out, chopped salads and bowls of pasta and stuff. And off the back of that, the publisher of that said, I think actually, you've kind of, what you're doing here. Why didn't you do your own? So it was a very natural process. I didn't write proposals. I didn't send it out to lots of publishers. I kind of, this was actually a world before, dare we say, Instagram, before social media really existed. And it's so, my first book only came out 11 years ago. It's not like, but it feels such a different time.
Oh.
So, that was the route through to writing my cookbooks, really.
How many have you done now?
I'm just working on my 6th. Yeah. So
it's quite prolific, actually.
Well, yeah, it is. I remember having a chat with Diana Henry once, who is, just an absolute sort of hero of mine. And she sort of said, well, I've done one every single year apart from the year I got divorced. So you must keep up that pace. And I'm afraid, Diana, I failed you. I haven't done one a year, but I think I've done one every sort of, 2 or 3 years. But I do also very much feel that, how many cookbooks can a person write, and how many cookbooks can a person have in their home? I really feel like it takes quite a few years for the ideas to percolate, for the recipes to be good enough, for the sort of me to sort of have worked out visually and creatively what I want a book to be. So yeah.
So let's move on to this house. How long have you been here for?
Been here for about 15 years. I've been here.
Really? That's decent, actually.
Yeah,
By modern standards, Anna, that's good going. So tell me about your first meeting with it.
So I was living in a little flat in London Fields, and I knew that I really felt the sense that I wanted a front door. I wanted to walk off the pavement through a front door. I just had this really strong sense of that. And I wasn't necessarily looking for a house, but a carpenter used to live in this house. And a friend of mine did some work for him, and he said it was going on the market. And I came to look around it with my dad at that point. John and I were together, but he was living in Cornwall. I was still living here. It was kind of the beginnings of our relationship. And yeah, I came to look at it with my dad, didn't look at any other houses, and put an offer in. in a way that that's the story you never hear about anything.
Yeah.
You never hear that about properties, but I sort of walked through the door and got a really, really nice sense of it. The house feels quite different now. They were quite sort of minimal, I think. There was lots of, they'd taken lots of the kind of like coving and architraves away. There was no skirting boards. Everything was painted white. There was a lovely plywood kitchen. It was a lovely, lovely house. And they had three children here. And I just got a really nice sense from it. I liked, the garden felt nice, and I was working really, really hard then. I hadn't quite started writing my books yet, and I was doing lots of kind of TV food commercials.
Okay.
So they were very late nights, very early mornings, and I sort of put an offer in, and it all almost happened without me really thinking about it too much.
A quick interlude to let you know that there's a house tour to accompany this episode, which is available to insiders on Patreon. Here's a short preview.
I guess one of the perks of being a chef is you can sort of always justify buying another bowl or plate. So these are by a really lovely ceramicist who lives down the road.
Beautiful.
She's called Pip Hartle. If I'm eating a bowl of noodles out of here, or, I don't know, a little stew or a pasta out of here, it has to be the right vessel. These are by Jono Smart, who's a really, and these ones don't get given to the kids. They're so fine and delicate, and
beautiful.
I absolutely love them. That's what you'd find if you were around Nigel Slater's house.
You find
I'm a bit more durable.
Do you think that's a good thing? Because are you someone that is quite instinctive like that in everyday life?
I think I'm one of two things. I'm either incredibly instinctive or an unbelievable overthinker, as you can tell by the fact that I still haven't got like mirrors in my bathroom, paintings on the walls, because it needs to be the right one. So in some ways I'm quite good at going with my gut, but if I sort of override that first response, I can really get into sort of questioning myself. But I also think at that point in my life, in my 20s, I think I was much more instinctive because there was less at stake. I didn't have kids. It was just me that I was really thinking about. Also, it just felt amazing. It felt like I had earned enough money to buy half of a little flat with my friend. And then off the back of that, I managed to buy this house. And, in my 20s, that just felt like a miracle, to have a house. It felt like I felt so privileged and happy to be in it. And so this house has seen all sorts of versions of me. I lived here on my own. I lived here with a kind of housemate. I lived here just me and John. And then we've lived here as a family. So it's really seen so many different versions of my life. And I really love that. And we've thought about moving so many times, but something would have to be really good to make us move, I think.
It's a sign of real success, isn't it? If a home can be that adaptable to different life stages in that way. When did you put this kitchen extension on?
In 2020, the best time to do building work.
I heard that.
Yeah, it was brilliant. We actually were living at my mum and dad's, so we were doing it over, FaceTime or whatever with a builder. It was really weird because we were sort of driving up here with masks on, getting out. The builder was sort of outside, and we'd come in and sort of look around the house and wonder if we were going to be in trouble. We didn't do that in the very tricky bit of lockdown, but yeah, it felt a very strange time to be doing this quite exciting thing. And I think it added a sort of layer of stress because, famously, renovations are reasonably, can be reasonably fraught, can't they? And this extra layer where we couldn't actually be here and we couldn't actually feel the feeling of the building felt tricky. But that's when my friend Kate came in. So Kate Sessions, who's one of my best friends, lived about 6 doors down. And because of all of that, and because of her great skill with interiors and her amazing taste and knowing, what taps are the taps I was sort of imagining in my head. And she had a name and a brand and a place you could buy them. She was really our sort of eyes and ears and came over here much more to sort of help with that process. So thank goodness.
So she sort of advised rather than designing it.
Yeah, absolutely. She sort of...
little black book.
Yeah, I felt like I really knew the things that I wanted, and Kate helped me sort of find those things, and then could be the person here to come in and be our eyes and our ears and our heart in this house when we really couldn't actually get here. Yeah.
So you were saying earlier, as you kindly showed me around, your kitchen, well, you've got this Devol unit here, sort of rough sawn timber with marble on top. This is where you develop your recipes and where you shoot them often as well. So it's kind of, it's a family kitchen, but it's also a working kitchen, isn't it? For you?
Yeah, it is. It really is. It's a working kitchen, and I think, our sort of view of working kitchens, perhaps not this kitchen. It might be more sort of stainless steel and knife racks and, pans hanging from racks and that kind of thing. But I know from doing lots of kind of cooking in lots of wild and different places, from working, on food TV shows and doing food commercials, I've sort of cooked all over the place, mountainsides, up, the top of olive groves, in the back of really, really sketchy vans, outside sort of, shoots when I was, doing commercials and stuff. So I really feel like I wanted a calm space to cook in. And this to me feels really calm. And actually for me to have creative thoughts and have the space to think, I need sort of expanses of space. So I think that was sort of the thought behind this.
Yeah.
Because it does two things, this kitchen. It sort of feeds our family, and it is where we eat and kind of have people round, but it also is my workspace. And for a while I had a separate studio kitchen, but that just didn't work. It just didn't feel sort of honest in a way.
Interesting, yeah.
I wonder whether I sort of hold myself too much down to kind of like truthfulness and honesty. But if these recipes aren't being cooked in my home kitchen, they cease to be the things I want them to be.
Fascinating. Yeah.
I want to cook them for my husband and my kids and my mates when they come round. I don't want to cook them in a scenario that is fake. I want to cook them in, it has to be rooted here. It has to be cooked here. And of course there are times, the odd day on a book shoot or whatever that we might go to, a studio just so we can get more stuff done, and not have, my 3-year-old running around. But in general, everything happens here, and everything is recipes that I would make for my family and are part of the tapestry of my life.
Yeah, it's a great way of doing it. I mean, so you're obviously doing media stuff, you're doing writing and things like that when you've got a book coming. I mean, but when you're developing recipes, are you standing here in this kitchen going, come on, Anna, I've got to come up with a recipe. That's my job today.
Yeah.
Is come up with 5 recipes. Or does that emerge organically from cooking for your family?
It's a bit of a mixture, really. I think because the way I cook isn't necessarily... It's the front door box.
You've been burgled.
I don't know. It's probably a cookbook. That's the sound of a cookbook coming through the door.
Someone pitching to you.
Yeah. Lovely. What a treat. It's a mix, really. I think as a cook and as a person, I am quite instinctive, and I am quite kind of sensory led. So the way I would naturally cook perhaps doesn't lend itself to being written down. Just like, I guess, if you were trying to explain how a painter did, a painting. But obviously, to allow people to replicate that, I have to kind of break that down into stages. So quite often I'll cook something for my family and I will write it down in a little notebook, or I'll even just sort of send it to myself in a voice note.
Yeah.
And then I will sort of take calm time another day to really make sure that I'm explaining that the right way, because there are assumed pieces of knowledge that just, that I just know happens, the sound that, courgettes might make when, they actually, that, they've caramelized enough and they've changed from green and raw to kind of sweet and caramelized. And all of those kind of sensory visual cues that are part of my cooking need to be written down, because I really feel like they are the key bits of a recipe to me.
And how precise or prescriptive is it? I mean, if you think about Jamie Oliver again, he sort of started us off with the whole, a glug of olive oil rather than a precise amount, for example. Where do you fall on that spectrum?
I think a recipe is, in a way, a bit of a container. I think when people are cooking from a recipe, they are looking to be sort of held with the wisdom of someone else who's done it before. And so I err towards a little bit more detail than I would like myself. Because I think, a confident cook can just whoosh by that. They don't have to read, a lot of my friends who are cooks will look at the ingredients list, look at the picture and, and they won't really read the method. So, but I do think there are people who do want to know that it's, that it's 15 grams of basil, because there are people who really, who that is important to. And I think actually cooking with my husband, John, has really taught me that, because he's a scientist. He really likes a method. He really likes, a process. He likes to chop up all of his stuff at the beginning, have it all ready, and then get into the cooking process, whereas I just turn a pan on and that's when I start chopping. So it's been a really good lesson in the different ways people cook.
What does he do, John?
He's a chemist by kind of like, sort of that's what he studied, but now he does kind of engineering and kind of, quite semiconductors. Do you know what that is?
Semiconductors, crikey. Sounds above my pay grade, that.
It's definitely above my pay grade.
Yeah.
It's a real conversation stopper sometimes, but he's also a surfer, so people love to talk to him about that.
Oh, fine. We forgive him. John, you're forgiven. How did you meet, you two?
We met at university, actually, but we didn't get together for a very long time after that. I had a boyfriend for a very long time, and he had a girlfriend, and we just loved each other as friends. And he was always the person, even when we'd both broken up with our prospective partners, he was always the person that I loved to have over. And in fact, I started trying to sell him to my single friends. I kept being like, he's the best guy. He's the greatest guy because of this reason, that reason, that reason. I think it was my sister that was like, I mean, is there something else going on? So yeah, we've known each other, for longer than we haven't now, which is quite nice.
That's really nice.
Yeah.
How would you explain the complementary characters and why it works between you?
Well, I think I'm much more focused on the visual aspect of our lives, on the kind of space that we live in, on the things that we eat. And John really appreciates those things, but they're not his drivers.
Okay.
John is really good he's quite a sort of steady person, John. And I say that with, thinking that actually that is, to me, really, really grounding and wonderful. And he's much better at kind of routine and remembering things and kind of, just really grounding our family in a way that I can be sort of like quite sort of flitty and have these thoughts and follow them off. And he's quite good at sort of bringing us back down, but not in a boring way, just in this very, very reliable, but kind of like deeply affirming way, and that, I think it's, it's ended up being quite a good combination.
It sounds ideal.
Yeah.
I think that's a really good combo. And do you think he might say, therefore, that you sometimes pull him slightly out of his routine?
Oh, definitely.
Yeah,
definitely. I bring a certain amount of chaos with me, I think.
Yeah.
But I think you can't be someone who maybe you can. I'm just thinking of cooks that are very, very kind of like ordered and particular. But I think there is a certain level of chaos that comes with cooking, especially when you've cooked in actual restaurant kitchens. It's such a sensory overload. It's like everything's going on. It's like it's organized chaos. And I feel like that's sort of what I bring. There is a level of sort of pre-thought to it, but also it's, I'm very good at doing things on the day. Not so good at what, not so good at the preparation.
Okay.
But isn't that a nice thing to like be at the age where you really can like recognize and own up to those things a bit?
I think it is. We need to understand ourselves at some point.
Yeah.
So what would be the downside of that side of your character? Because it sometimes must get a bit out of control, or.
Yeah, I think it means quite often I walk into things like unprepared,
Doing well today.
Thank you. Well, I had to tidy the house, Matt. So, there was a level of preparation.
Yeah.
But I do think also with that comes a kind of instinctive, ness and a passion that, I wouldn't sort of trade that in for being really organised, even though it frustrates me sometimes that I'm not more of a forward planner. But I have changed. As a mother, I have had to change. I really do think that I'm quite like my mom in that way. I sort of, my mom always says she has this thing called beam me up Scotty syndrome, where she basically thinks that she can leave to get somewhere at the time she's supposed to be there. And so all my life, we were always in a rush. We were always in a rush or always running late. And I was kind of fine with that, but that stressed my sister out a lot. And I really didn't, I know the character of my son, he wouldn't have been comfortable with that. So I've had to kind of like, re-engineer my character a bit as a mom.
Yeah.
So yeah, upwardly managed by my children.
Yeah. Well, on the subject of motherhood, I mean, so it's 10 years ago you had your first.
Yeah.
On this podcast, we make the link between the home and our inner selves, because our bodies and minds are kind of home. So I just wondered if motherhood initially, did it make you feel more at home in yourself, or did it challenge that sense of home inside you, would you say?
Oh, I think it's such a big shift, becoming a mother, becoming a parent. And when I say that, I really want to also say that I think there are other things in life that can bring, shifts like this, because I spent a long time really wanting to become a mother and really wanting to have a second child. And so I really understand the kind of like someone who might be listening to this, having wanted to become a mother and not been able to, or someone who just chooses not to have children. And I really sometimes can understand that the conversation around being a mother or being a parent feels quite exclusive. And actually, really, it is just another reflection of being a human and of having to sacrifice something in yourself to care for something or someone else, Yeah, but it was a big shift for me becoming a mother.
How old were you?
I was 36, I think. So
Okay.
probably a little bit, towards the
Over the hill?
Yeah, over the hill, exactly. Well, I had my second kid when I was 43. So that was definitely, they were calling me geriatric at 36. Love that language from the medical profession. Thank you very much. I bet it was a man who wrote that. But anyway, that's a whole nother podcast. But yeah, it was definitely, I think because I established myself so much as a person then, I was really kind of in the flow of my career, and I was so happy that I was writing books and doing the thing that I loved. I didn't want to stop that. So trying to but I also had this very strong feeling that I wanted to be a very present mother. I wanted to be around. And so I didn't really want anyone looking after my kids. So trying to kind of balance those two things. And also that sense of kind of, you almost lose yourself and then rebuild a new version of yourself, I think, when you become a mother or a parent. And that, So that loss of the life that I had, there was a sense of, I think, grieving for that actually. Um, and I found that really tricky for a while. And, I think I definitely had, sort of at some points what you would probably call postnatal depression, where I had this wonderful life that, I had this beautiful child that, luckily I never had difficult feelings towards my son, because I know that can be an aspect
Yeah.
of depression and postnatal conditions. But I had this life that, was everything I'd worked for, was everything I wanted, but, still really kind of couldn't make sense of why I was feeling low. That was a real sort of learning process, because actually I think I've really always been quite a buoyant person. And that was the first time that I'd really let myself feel low. Um, so yeah, it took a while to come back from that.
Oh, I'm sorry to hear that. I mean, I've had some experience of that. I've seen that in action, and I mean, how do you look back on it now? I mean, do you think that you'd be sort of easier on yourself now somehow, or
I think I would be easier on myself now. And I had a 7-year gap between my children. And actually, the age my son is now, 3, was really when I felt sort of the lowest, um, you know, first time round. I, and you also feel guilty as well, because you feel like it's not your child that is the reason for this, but it is motherhood that is, in some ways the reason for this. And I think, I definitely wanted it to all sort of be this sort of like, frolicking lambs perfection. And so there is a guilt that you put on yourself as well, especially as someone who's really driven by sort of visual things, someone who has people pleasing tendencies, someone who leans towards perfectionism at times, and when all of that is sort of like this huge big quagmire of emotions, it is so challenging. But I think I've definitely been much easier on myself this time. I think it's also the second time round, you're not making that shift from becoming a person on their own to a
yeah?
person that is responsible for other people. Um, and so it's definitely easier that second time. But I think, I think the older I get, I'm slowly letting go of those sort of ties to perfectionism and keeping everyone else happy.
Well, that's good.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
Work in progress.
yeah. So how did you start to re-emerge from that period, do you think?
I think it was a combination of kind of just saying it out loud and recognizing, as it is with,
Mm.
most things, when you realize what's happening, sometimes it's the beginning of the end. And I think it was sort of naming it and naming the fact that I was feeling low and telling everyone around me that that was happening, because I don't think, John absolutely noticed, because he was like, wow, what are you doing? But also I'm a very strong-willed person. I know that I can be quite hard to help, because
Okay.
one of the sort of, hats I wear is someone who can do everything. And maybe it does stem from that little girl who decided, she didn't want to ask for help or couldn't be the one that unraveled. So I think, I think at that moment I sort of had to unravel, and I had to say, like, I need help now. And that's when community steps in, isn't it? And, John stepped up, my parents, my family, and it was by sort of, on the scale of sort of postnatal depression, it was fairly mild, it was fairly minor, but that doesn't feel like that in your life. I
Mm.
didn't have to go to hospital, I didn't have to go on medication, but I just had to make a shift. But it was saying it out loud and knowing what it was that helped me make that, I think.
Okay. So it sounds like actually just as well, the people that love you
Mm.
helped you with that
Yeah.
support structure.
Yeah, rallied round. Yeah, absolutely.
That's
Absolutely.
amazing, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah. And I feel like we're slightly off as societies now in the way we support mothers, aren't we? Because we live in these quite, nuclear families. And, my mum and dad are an hour and a half away, and they're amazing and they've always helped and they're so generous as grandparents. But, there's not an auntie living upstairs. There's not someone you can, throw your kid out when you need to walk out the house for a couple of hours. Not throw your kid out, but hand your kid over gently too. You know. So yeah.
Yeah, I did a podcast not long ago with a guy called Johan Hari, who's a writer, and he published a brilliant book called Lost Connections. And on the podcast, we talked about how we've sort of divorced ourselves from our homes in the sense that this kind of sense of belonging that we all want to feel.
Yeah.
We're not really feeling it because we're so fractured as a society, as you point out. We tend to be quite a long way from our old friends, and family live scattered all over the place. I'm generalizing. A lot of people have got it right, but I think so many of us haven't. And then, the political situation always feels quite uneasy. And I think online forms of belonging can be a bit hollow somehow. I think it's kind of the defining feature of our age, actually.
Yeah. Yeah.
And when you become a parent, that's when you feel it so in such a turned up way. That's what I experienced anyway.
Yeah, I think you really do. And I think that's when, community really comes in. And that's what that was one of my kind of intentions for this year, was to kind of, instead of, ordering the thing online, just to get on the train, go to the shop, go to my local shop and pick up my food, do have as many of those kind of human interactions a day.
That's interesting. Have you done that deliberately?
Yeah, I tried to do that deliberately, because I think when, especially living in kind of like the middle of London, you can, everything could land on my doorstep. I would never have to leave the house. And as someone who works at home, and who's, John also works at home, I really have made a conscious effort to go and do those things. And whether it's a 2-minute interaction with the shopkeeper, or whether I see 3 or 4 people that I know on the way, to the shops, I think it's all feeding that sort of part of us that needs those connections. And if family aren't on the doorstep, my sister and brother do actually live close, and I'm lucky in that sense. But even though they live, a couple of miles away, it's difficult to get there in the way we live our lives now, isn't it?
It is.
So, yeah.
It is. Do you, having been through that difficult period after your firstborn arriving, did you make any changes to the way that you live your life? I mean, is there anything that you do for your well-being specifically in everyday life?
I think early on in my career, I really wanted to do and be everything, and I had a real sort of sense of sort of comparison, and sort of, checking myself against the other people who were doing what I was doing. And I think probably it's age, it's motherhood, it's, having less time to think about it also. But I really have come to the point now where I think I just want to do 1 or 2 things really well. And to me, the books I write are very meaningful. I love the fact that it's an object that exists, that I hope will exist in, 10, 20 years' time. It's something tactile that you can hold in your hands. It's a thing that I am creating with a team of wonderful other creative people. And so I think I've just, decided that actually just doing a couple of things absolutely to the sort of apex of what I can do them to, feels like a change I've made. And that feels really good to kind of exist in that, rather than exist in this space where you're trying to be everything.
That sounds really good. That sounds healthy. So you talked about that really tragic situation with your family friends and the Lockerbie disaster when you were young. Have you experienced loss as an adult?
Yeah, I've lost a few. Obviously, I've lost sort of older members of the family, and my auntie Avril, who was, I've mentioned a couple of times, who was the oldest of my dad's 12 brothers and sisters. And losing her was, pretty major, because she felt like the real kind of both who my sister and I really wanted to be. We wanted to live a life as fully as she did. And in the absence of sort of having a grandparent for most of my adult life, she was really that person. So I've lost kind of, older family members, but I've also lost a couple of friends to breast cancer. My friend Laura and my friend Chris, both just miraculous human beings who kind of lived with the disease for quite a long time. And both really campaigned for a difference in kind of diagnosis. And my friend Chris started a charity called Copperfield, which she started, she got diagnosed in her early 20s. And her and her twin sister, who is still around more and is still a friend, started this amazing breast cancer charity that was really targeting young women, and the fact that lots of women, young women, weren't diagnosed as quickly as they should have been. But Chris's death particularly was really quite a sort of formative thing for me, because she knew she was going to die. She had, I think, 13 years of living with a terminal illness. And wow. So the way she went about her death was so inspiring. She really got into conversations with all of us about dying, and with all of us about what we thought, how we imagined our deaths to be, how we would feel if we were to die tomorrow. And they're not conversations you have very often. And she really wanted, I think, she did so many fantastic things in her life, but in dying, she really wanted her death to kind of put a lens to all of us about, having conversations about death, about not being, obviously we're all scared of death, but about kind of really thinking practically about how that might be and how that might look. And she actually had a living funeral, which was one of the most unbelievable things that I've got goosebumps all over just talking about it. We went all to the cathedral down in Truro, and she was there. And as the eulogies were given, her coffin was there. We all signed her coffin. We all kind of like paid our respects to her with her in the room. Wow. And I think, she's one of those people who has shifted the perspective, not just for me, but for so many people who loved her. And she lived at 100 miles an hour. So she packed more into her 38 or 39 years, whatever it was, than most people do in 100 lifetimes.
How amazing. What, quite a tricky one, but what have you learned from that loss, would you think, that you've taken away?
I often think of her when there's a kind of like do I, don't I situation, because she was always the first person to kind of like get in her bikini and run into freezing cold water. She was always the first person to kind of like, be at the party, and do those very kind of full life-giving things. But she was also always the first person to say no to a plan if it was too much. I think she actually has been a big part of teaching me how to say no, because I think she knew that she had sort of finite life force, know, and that was very real to her. We all obviously have it. We all have it, but it's just not as obvious to those of us who might live longer lives, touch everything, touch wood. But she knew that she had this finite life source. So when she said yes with every cell of her being. And when she said no, so clearly, but with no apology. She was like, no, I can't do this, and I think that is almost as important as the yes.
That's fantastic. Boundaries.
Yeah.
Would you say that you're someone that sometimes struggle with boundaries in that way then?
I think so. I think that's just a part of, wanting to keep everyone happy, and wanting to kind of be, also wanting to be the person that can do everything and can be a capable person. So, yeah, I've definitely, that's something I've really learned is, how to sort of say no gracefully without really, sending a sort of like over apologetic message, just knowing. And I think motherhood and being a parent has been a big part of being able to do that.
Yeah. Yeah, I can't remember where I learned this not that long ago, but someone very wise was counselling you to just not have to explain something all the time. So it is actually fine if you get invited to something or someone asks you to do something you're not comfortable with. It's okay just to say no without the flourish.
Yeah.
Because the problem with the flourish is that they then have to assess whether your no is worth it. I don't know, pluck an example where you don't want to come to my party because you think it's not as important as you doing X with your friend or whatever it is you're doing.
Yeah.
So I quite like that. I've tried to carry that through.
Yeah. It can be difficult. It can be difficult. And I think there's an Englishness to kind of like being polite and perhaps over-explaining.
Yeah, it's so true. There was a potential guest I was going to get on the podcast a while back. She's based in America. And it was fantastic. We asked her, do you want to come on the podcast and talk about X and Y? And she just emailed back and said, I'll pass. It was slightly more, more dressed up than that, but there was no reason. There was no reason. And actually, I respected it. It was pretty cool. Yeah. But it's quite hard as a Brit to do that.
Yeah, it's quite hard. I find that really hard.
Yeah. That's why you're here today.
Yeah. Well, no, come on. I think that's something that, I'm getting better at. I don't think I'll ever get to I'll pass. That's not, That's...
I won't either, to be fair.
But huge respect for that.
Yeah. So the final question for you is given everything we've talked about, given that you've been here for a long time and you described these different lives that you've had here, from being on your own to being with John to now a family, where does this building sort of rank in terms of your important things in your life, and how would you summarize the role it plays and what it means to you?
Yeah, it's really difficult to put into words, really, what this building is. I paced the halls of, the upstairs of this house in labour with my son. It's the things that have happened in this house are, it feels like are going to be some of the most formative moments and most important things that will ever happen to me and will ever happen to the 4 humans that live here. So it really is, it feels part of us. It feels like it lives with us and breathes with us and is part of us. And, just as I get frustrated with family members, I get frustrated with this house. I get frustrated that it hasn't got this or it hasn't got that, or I haven't replaced the sofa or this or that or the other. So it's a dialogue, I feel like, that is, it's sometimes it's joyful, sometimes it's frustrating, sometimes it's, the whole of life is in this house. And I mean that in sort of 2 senses, and I feel just so grateful for it, actually. What a privilege to have, a really solid, safe, and, to me, beautiful environment to live in. And that is such a blessing. And whether this is our house forever and ever, I don't know, but I will be thankful for this place, with, to my last breath.
What a lovely answer. You got your own front door.
Yeah, I've got my own front door. I can just stroll through anytime I like.
Yeah, I really like the way you put that earlier. That's really brilliant.
Yeah.
Thanks so much, Anna. It's been, thanks for your openness, and you've been really generous, and it's been fascinating to meet you.
Oh, well, I've just loved talking to you, Matt. Thank you.
Thank you.